So hello everyone, I'm Mohammad. I'm a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Heritage Studies at BTU University, and I'm also working as a lecturer and research assistant in the Department of Environmental Planning here. So my work is somehow kind of interdisciplinary work in terms of disaster risk management, climate change issues, and heritage impact assessment. And I'm looking at the methodology, specifically in the methodology of assessment method for cultural heritage sites. So as Dr. Rip already mentioned, in terms of resilience, so resilience is one of the current issue in management of cultural heritage sites against, for protection of cultural heritage site from natural hazards, from climate change threats, from development pressure, from tourism pressure, so different threats which may impact our cultural heritage sites. And to reach a resilient, for example, urban cultural heritage sites, so the question is that how we can reach this resilience and how we can increase the resilience of our cultural heritage sites within the management plan. So I'm looking at the gap we have already in terms of increased resilience for cultural heritage sites. And one of the existing gap is systematic and comprehensive methodology for risk or impact assessment. So today I'm looking at an integrated, I'm going to develop a more integrated approach for heritage impact assessment. So my presentation today is divided into three main parts. First of all, I'm looking at the multiple hazards and threats threatening cultural heritage sites. Secondly, I'm talking about how to choose the suitable methodology for different kinds of threats. And finally, how to take it forward exactly for to reach a more integrated approach. So when we talk about the heritage impact assessment, first of all, we may imagine different types of threats and impacts we may have. Yeah, I know. So first of all, so we should know about the different kinds of threats or hazards which may threaten our cultural heritage sites. So you can see here, for example, we have two different types of threats: the natural variability and the anthropogenic, which means like human-induced threats. So within the natural variability, we have the sudden onset hazards, like geological hazard, like earthquake, climatic hazard, like floods. We have also slow onset hazards, like environmental hazard, environmental degradation, deforestation, droughts, or climate change issues, like heavy rain, like atmospheric change, humidity change, temperature change, winds, these kind of issues. And sometimes the climate change and like sudden onset hazards are interconnected. For example, extreme heavy rain may cause floods. So they are, in the reality, they are interconnected, but within the scientific and academic environment, we need to separate these different threats because they belong to different disciplines when we are going to conduct a systematic methodology of assessment. We have also human-induced threats like development, like urban or rural development, new construction, land use change, land use policy change. Also, we have tourism pressure, infrastructure related to tourism, and man-made hazards. So man-made hazards like wars, civil unrest, and these kind of issues we are facing, for example, in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt nowadays. Apart from these different natural and man-made hazards, we have also some threats and issues related to mismanagement. So lack of maintenance and also lack of risk management, risk preparedness, impact assessment is another threat which may impact our cultural heritage sites. So we have the multiple hazards, multiple threats in terms of cultural heritage protection. When it comes to World Heritage Sites, for example, because we have a lot of data in terms of World Heritage Sites, so we can look at statistics. This is the State of Conservation 2014, and you can see, for example, here, the management and institutional factors affecting cultural heritage sites like 80%. Or we have the building and development, new construction, affecting cultural heritage sites. We have transportation infrastructure. We have also sudden ecological and geological events, natural hazards, for example, 60%. We have the climate change. We have all these different threats, and based on these statistics, you may figure out how our cultural heritage sites are affected by these different threats. You may know also within the World Heritage nomination process, the number 4, we are dealing with the state of conservation and factors affecting the property. And within the factors affecting the property, we have, again, this development pressure, environmental pressure and climate change, natural hazards, and tourism pressure. So these are the main categories of hazard and threats in terms of cultural heritage protection. But how we are going to deal with these different threats, if there is any methodology, if there is any specific methodology to assess the impacts or to assess the risks for all these trends. So this is the question, but the problem is there is no specific methodology for all these threats. When we are dealing with risk assessment, for example, the natural hazards or man-made hazards, we should go through the disaster risk management discipline. Or when dealing with climate change impacts, we should go through environmental planning discipline, climate change impact assessment and climate change impact adaptation. And in terms of development pressure and tourism pressure, the new approach, the current approach, heritage impact assessment. And I'm going to explain these 3 different tools, assessment tools or instruments in the further slides, and then take it more forward to reach a more integrated approach. So first of all, in terms of natural hazards and human-induced approach. So we have natural hazards and human-induced threats, and within the discipline of disaster risk management, when you are going to assess a risk of natural hazards to the cultural heritage property, you may use the disaster risk assessment methodology. Disaster risk assessment or disaster risk management, we usually apply this framework or disaster risk assessment methodology for sudden onset hazards, geological, climatic, and some kind of slow onset hazard like environmental hazards. Also, disaster risk management, we may apply it to human-induced threats, only the man-made hazards, like wars or civil unrest. Apart from this, we should consider the mismanagement and disaster and lack of risk management. So this kind of institutional or management like weakness at your cultural heritage sites. That's also very important because lack of institutional or management system can increase the vulnerability of your cultural heritage sites to potential natural hazards. So one of the problems is in terms of terminology and also methodology in these 3 different methodological approach. For example, in terms of disaster risk management, we have disaster risk management means like avoidance or reducing or compensating the disaster risks to cultural heritage sites. So we have 3 different strategies to deal with natural hazards. First of all, prevention strategies. So prevention is going to avoid or totally prevent the disaster risks by 100%. It's in most cases impossible, especially for cultural heritage sites, because, for example, you cannot relocate a cultural heritage site or cultural or like a historic urban community. You cannot relocate it to the safe place in terms of authenticity of problem, integrity, the livelihood, the identity of the place. So it's not a favorable strategy in terms of cultural heritage. But mitigation is the common one. How to reduce the disaster risk. So we accept that we cannot prevent hazard, we cannot prevent earthquake or floods, but we can reduce the disaster risks. How we can reduce the risk? For example, we can increase the resilience of our building. We can increase the resilience of the local population associated to the cultural heritage site, or we can reduce the vulnerability of institutional vulnerability, management vulnerability, or vulnerability of the structure and material of our cultural heritage sites. And also preparedness is a strategy how to react during emergency response when a disaster happens, or how to, for example, recover or rehabilitate a cultural heritage site affected by a disaster. So in advance of a disaster or hazard, we are planning for during the disaster and after the disaster. This is the concept of preparedness. So preparing ourselves in advance. So cultural heritage sites and within the disaster risk management, if we take a look at the international agenda, for example, the post-2015 UN Development Agenda, you know that realizing the future we want for all. So the 4 dimensions of sustainability, you know there are 4 dimensions of sustainability mentioned in this agenda. And one of the environmental sustainability, and within the environmental sustainability, we have the key like disaster risk reduction and increased resilience. And it's mentioned that traditional and indigenous knowledge as one of the key for resilience. So some kind of intangible heritage we are dealing with. And also it's mentioned integrating disaster risk reduction into sustainable development strategies. And within the sustainable development strategies, we have already included cultural heritage sites. Actually, the cultural heritage sites included within the environment, but it needs more like activity to highlight what is the role of cultural heritage in the sustainable development and how we can protect cultural heritage sites by applying the disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. Also the importance of risk assessment. So following that in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we have the Goal 11, make cities and human settlement inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And it's very interesting that within this goal, we have the target 4, strengthening the efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. So within the concept of resilience and sustainability, we have the separate and individual like target for protection of cultural heritage sites. And that's very interesting how cultural heritage site has been included and how the concept of culture and cultural resilience has been included within this international agenda. Following this, we have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and the concept of cultural resilience within the disaster risk management approach. So this is one example how cultural heritage sites may be affected by different natural hazards. We just produced this map based on the overlapping the map of seismic hazards, UNICR 1999, and a UNESCO map of World Cultural Heritage Sites 2013. And you can see these different dots, how many cultural heritage sites are located in the regions with probability of earthquake. For example, here, if you just take a look at the statistics, you may realize that like 15% of world cultural heritage sites are located in a high or very high probability of earthquake regions. But regarding the integrated approach, maybe I can start from here. What does it mean, integrated approach? So, first of all, we should have the integrated approach to 3 different phases of disaster risk management: before disaster, during disaster, and after disaster. And the concept here is disaster, not hazard. So, the problem with the traditional approach to risk management was just taking a look at the hazard. For example, the hazard can be here flood or earthquake. But when hazard happen, like in the region in which a cultural heritage site is located, then we may have a disaster. And disaster is not an earthquake. Disaster is a crisis situation. Disaster is a situation which may affect the cultural heritage sites and its setting. So, when we say disaster risk management or disaster risk assessment, we mean that we are going to identify and predict the different risks within these disasters. So not only the earthquake, what earthquake may cause to cultural heritage site, like physical, destruction, like structural or material. No, because there are a lot of internal risk factors, external risk factors, and your cultural heritage site is linked to the built environment, to the natural environment, to the community. So, for example, when earthquake happen, it may cause damage to a gas line or electricity line close to your cultural heritage sites and cause explosion. And then explosion cause another additional damage to your cultural heritage sites. Or may earthquake block the access road to your cultural heritage sites, so then firefighters or experts cannot reach your cultural heritage sites. So it is like a complex system. And there are a lot of risks there. That's why then we have the direct loss of earthquake, direct loss, and also the consequential loss, and a lot of sociocultural loss. So I give you an example how this integrated approach should be addressed. If you take a look at this slide, you may imagine different natural hazards, but it is only one disaster. The Great Hanshin Japan earthquake and tsunami 2011. The earthquake happens in the ocean near to the Tokyo region in Japan, and then this earthquake caused a lot of damage to different historical buildings in the Tokyo region. But the earthquake, because it happens in the ocean, is also caused tsunami. And then tsunami affect the city, a lot of city and coastal area. Also, earthquake caused the damage to the lifelines, and it caused explosion and fire. And you know, this is the most destructive disaster, hazards in Japan, because a lot of cultural heritage sites in Japan are based on the wooden materials. Then earthquake, you know what that's, these terrible threats and terrible man-made hazards happen by earthquake and nuclear explosion. So you see, the earthquake was only primary hazards, but the disaster is not an earthquake. Disaster is the whole complex system and the whole a domino effect. You can see the earthquake, tsunami, fire, flooding, and also we may have some human-induced threats, like looting, following an earthquake. As you can see, for example, in Syria, the a lot of kind of human-induced threats following the wars and civil unrest. So the disaster is the combination. The disaster begins with a primary hazard, but it's a combination of all different like human and natural hazards within heritage, urban or rural areas. Another example, which is a case study of my Ph.D. thesis, is the case of BAM and its cultural landscape in Iran. As you can see, this is the BAM citadel or Argi BAM. This is before the earthquake. And the material is based on the mud layer and mud bridge, and it dates back to 6th to 4th century BC, Achaemenid period in Iran. And an earthquake happened in 2003, and this is the the picture in 2008, 5 years following the earthquake. The property immediately inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2004, the earthquake we have in 2003 and in 2004, through an emergency nomination, it has been inscribed, and at the same time, it's placed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in danger. And following the restoration, 2 years ago, it's removed from the list in danger. When take a look at the property, first of all, because it has a great story of authenticity and integrity. Following the earthquake, there has been a lot of destruction in the citadel, but mainly in those parts which has been restored during the past 30 years. So the original structure and the original material was remain intact or with a low level of damage, and that's very interesting. Also, the earthquake revealed a lot of new archaeological sites and new historical layers of the building. So by the expert evaluation in ECOMOS, they just realized that the property can still convey the outstanding universal value in an authentic way. So, and in terms of integrity, I can say that, first of all, the estate party wanted to place this citadel, only this Algibam or citadel within the heritage list, but following some meetings and discussion, they realized that there is a canal system which is an irrigation, underground irrigation system. You can see here to bring the water from mountainous area to the desert environment, because this city is located in a desert environment. And there is also some gardens and orchards following the citadel, and also there are some structure like architectural remaining and structure, archaeological sites, and this kind of architectural elements. So at the end, they just decided to have this core zone for the property. So now the property is not only a monument, it's a cultural landscape. And you can see here, this is the citadel, this is the gardens and date palm orchards. The economic situation in the city of Bam is based on these gardens. That's very important, which is part of the property. This is the traditional technique of earthen architecture and adobe materials. There are some kinds of rituals and practices and ceremonies within the citadel, because there is a mosque and some museum within the citadel, and this is the cultural landscape of Bam. But when we look at these different elements of the property, you may realize how the role of the property in the sustainable development of the city. In terms of architectural, this is the earthen architecture, and it can reflect the traditional way of construction in the city of Bam. The tourism industry, the irrigation canal system for irrigating the date palm orchards. The palm orchards itself, in terms of economic value of the property, in terms of environmental, the sustainable water management system of Kannat, also like the agricultural land use, traditional agricultural land use. And in terms of sociocultural issues, the religious rituals, ceremonies, and the social structure connected to Kannat for distributing the water between different gardens within the city. And you can see the property, the values of the property, how these different values are playing a key role in the different like dimension of sustainability and sustainable development of the city. And this is the role of these cultural heritage sites. And when we realize that how this can play a key role in different dimensions, then we may realize that how it can increase the overall resilience of the city to the disasters. If we go back to the disaster in 2003 in the city of Bam, it's mentioned that one of the main factors for accelerating the rehabilitation and recovery of the city of Bam was this property. Only this cultural property and different cultural elements of the city attract a lot of international attentions, a lot of budget, a lot of workshops, a lot of consideration within the city, and it really accelerated the rehabilitation and recovery of the whole city. And another issue in terms of integrated approach is considering the intangible aspect of the heritage apart from the tangible one. As I mentioned, in the case of BAM, here we have the agricultural land use practices. We have the traditional knowledge of construction. We have the ceremonies and rituals, and a lot of intangible aspects connected to the property. And a lot of them have been affected by earthquake. So this is not only tangible aspects which may be affected by natural hazards. There is also intangible aspect. And this is a picture when I was in Japan, in Kyoto, this summer for a disaster risk management workshop, the UNESCO workshop for disaster risk management. This is a shrine in a small town in the Japan, which was affected by tsunami in 2011. And you can see here this lady is doing kind of traditional practices, and this is an element, it's like storytelling. And she's telling the story to the children every week, how the different disasters during the history of this town happened, and how the people, they just reacted against these disasters, and how what should be done, and so different experience of the history of disasters. And it was very interesting for me how the risk preparedness, educational training and educational system can be integrated within the intangible aspects and intangible heritage within this shrine. And you can see here this element, also this one, which one of the oldest good luck in using in different houses in Japan to protect the house from natural hazards. This is the methodology of disaster risk management and also risk assessment. I'm not going to go too much into detail, just to mention that the risk assessment is within the disaster risk management, and it's a very important aspect, because if you conduct a scientific risk assessment, then you can develop the mitigation, preparedness, and recovery plan specific to your cultural heritage sites. Because disaster risk assessment, within disaster risk assessment, you should assess all different natural hazards. You should assess the value of your cultural heritage sites, or social cultural background. And you should know the like architectural construction techniques. Then based on these two, you can identify the vulnerability of cultural heritage sites and you can identify the risks. And this risk is exactly what you need for developing the mitigation. So at the end, your strategy would be site-specific strategy. Not the general one, not the recommendation, all because there are a lot of recommendations and guidelines you can use, but a lot of them are not suitable for your cultural heritage sites. So moving to climate change and climate change impact assessment. In terms of climate change methodology, you are dealing with slow onset hazards and climate change issues. Apart from that, you should consider the lack of maintenance and lack of risk management and or impact assessment at your cultural heritage sites. That's also very important because always this kind of, like for example, the improper interventions may increase the vulnerability of your cultural heritage site to the future hazards. That's very important. For example, in case of BAM, as I mentioned, a lot of damage happened in those parts which were restored, and a lot of restoration projects were done on these parts. So that was exactly because the improper intervention, incompatibility of the modern materials, traditional materials, lack of understanding of the construction techniques, and also non-physical aspects like the lack of institutional or management system dealing with risk. But when we go through the terminology of climate change, the climate change which is related to the human activity in increasing the greenhouse gases, and the greenhouse gases may change the temperature, may change the moisture, and that cause a lot of problems. Within the climate change discipline, we have the mitigation, which means the reduction of greenhouse gases. As you remember, in the disaster risk management, I mentioned that mitigation means the reducing the risk or impact of natural hazards on your cultural heritage sites. But here, in the climate change issues, mitigation is reduction of greenhouse gases, like reduction of CO2. It's nothing to do with the heritage community. So that's why I'm mentioning that there are some gaps and differences between different disciplines and different methodology. How we can integrate this methodology while we are dealing with this different terminology. In climate change issues, we are dealing with adaptation, completely new terminology. So adaptation means because the climate change is like the changing climate, like a gradual change, we should adapt ourselves, we should adapt our cultural heritage site to this like gradual change. This is the new terms. So that's one of the differences in terms of terminology between disaster risk management and change. This is very interesting diagram by IPCC, International Panel of Climate Change 2012, and you can see here, because it's like interconnecting the disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. You can see here the climate variability and climate change issues may cause disasters, and disaster risk is something related to the vulnerability of your cultural heritage sites, the exposure of the location of your cultural heritage sites, and the climate variability. And this disaster risk may affect your development. And you need disaster risk management, you need climate change adaptation to retain your development process. But this development process, there's a lot of factories, a lot of traffic, a lot of plants causing greenhouse gases. And then greenhouse gases, because of the increased greenhouse gases, we have climate change. And then climate change again causes disaster. So this is our development causing disaster risk. if you take a look at this cycle, you see when we are dealing with disaster risk, for example, to our community or like built environment, first of all, we need to integrate the sustainability approach to our development. That's very important, because within the sustainability approach, we need to decrease the greenhouse gases. Of course, as I mentioned, the reducing greenhouse gases like CO2 is not in the responsibility of our heritage community. Sometimes it can be useful, for example, protection of natural heritage. You know, the forest can absorb the CO2, and this means we are reducing the greenhouse gases. Sometimes it can be applicable, but in general, we are not dealing with mitigation. We are dealing with adaptation in climate change. And when it comes to impacts and impact assessment, we are dealing with climate change, like different threats with climate change, like sea level rise, like wind-driven rain, wind-driven sand, and different threats of climate change. We should deal with the vulnerability of our cultural heritage sites, like the exposure, different types of cultural heritage sites, sensitivity of both physical and non-physical material, non-physical elements of our cultural heritage sites, and the existing adaptive capacity, resilience, like capacity, and disaster risk management for your cultural heritage site or in the region in which your cultural heritage site is situated. And then we can identify the impacts based on the climate change threats and the vulnerability of your cultural heritage site. So it's not only the climate change or natural hazards causing the risk or impact. The main factor is vulnerability of your cultural heritage site. Because, for example, earthquake may happen in a jungle or forest, and nothing happens. And sometimes it's useful for cultivation, you know, the earthquake. But when it happens in the built environment, so this is the problem with our built environment. We have a lot of damage. So it's not a problem, the earthquake is not a problem. The problem is our improper construction, improper infrastructure, improper urban planning, lack of coordination between different stakeholders dealing with the issue. This is the like impact assessment and vulnerability assessment methodology. I'm not again going through into details through this methodology. If someone interested in, after the discussion, we may have some meetings and we can go through that because it's really time consuming but just to mention that for the impact assessment or vulnerability assessment, first of all, we need to understand our cultural heritage sites. We need to identify both tangible and intangible elements. We need to assess the values of our cultural heritage sites. As I mentioned in the case of BAM, the values are very important, and our mission is protecting the value. It's not protecting the monuments itself or the physical aspects. In terms of the resilience, I can say the resilience in terms of natural hazards or climate change or development pressure and tourism, always the final target of our resilience approach for cultural heritage is protecting and retaining the heritage values. And in case of, for example, World Heritage Site, outstanding universal values and associated condition of authenticity and integrity. So first of all, we need to identify our cultural heritage site in both tangible and intangible attributes. Then we need to identify and assess the climate change parameters. So where we have our cultural heritage sites, we have the source of risk, which is climate change, and then we can identify the impacts of the threats on our cultural heritage sites and assess the vulnerability, and then develop the appropriate adaptation strategies for climate change. This is just an example of the assessment matrix. It has been done by the Department of Environmental Planning at our university by Professor Schmidt. And you can see here we have the different attributes of our cultural heritage site. This is a project, climate change impact assessment in Macedonia. You can see different elements of the cultural heritage sites. And here we have the different threats of climate change, like heavy rain, like floods, like moisture change. and then we can identify how these different threats can affect the different elements of our cultural heritage sites. This is only an approach and example for assessment. And the final tools we are dealing with is heritage impact assessment. Heritage impact assessment is the tools which has been developed within the framework of environmental impact assessment. In heritage impact assessment, we only dealing with human-induced threats, development and land use change, and tourism pressure. So within the heritage impact assessment approach, we are not dealing with climate change and no like natural hazards. Only these types of human-induced threats. And also, again, we need to consider the mismanagement and lack of maintenance. Always very important as an additional like criteria, factors which may cause additional threats. But as I mentioned, the heritage impact assessment is a new tool, and this new tool has been developed within the framework of environmental impact assessment. If you take a look at environmental, because environmental impact assessment is an instrument ratified by a lot of state parties around the world, and these tools, and legally binding, it's legally binding, and these tools is going to identify, evaluate, and mitigate the different effects of the development proposals to the cultural, to the environment, and the environment here means both natural and built environment. So this is the general definition of environments. If you go through the International Association of Impact Assessment, you can see the definition of environment. This is the general definition. So prior to a major decision making or prior to the construction start, we should like predict all impacts of a proposal or project or development on the environment. If it's going to negatively affect the environment, both built or natural, we should go through that if the project should be ratified, the project should be approved, or the project should be rejected. And if the project should be approved, we need to mitigate and reduce the adverse impact. So then we have the heritage impact assessment definition. Exactly the same. Identifying, predicting, and evaluating, communicating probable effects of the current or proposed development on the different types of cultural heritage sites, and then mitigating the adverse impacts. This is by International Network of Cultural Diversity 2004. Before the ICOMOS guideline and heritage impact assessment in 2010, we had this like publication, very scientific publication in terms of heritage impact assessment. So the only small difference between this definition and the broader environmental impact assessment approach is in heritage impact assessment, we are going to deal with both current and proposed policies and development projects. So here we are dealing only with proposals. Before a construction starts, we should evaluate everything. But here, when a construction starts, for example, something during construction, road construction, lifeline construction, shopping mall, everything, during the construction, even we can go through the heritage impact assessment, and if it's going to affect our cultural heritage site, we can stop it, if we have the power for that, of course, or at least we can mitigate the effects. So, within the heritage impact assessment, we are only dealing with one strategy, only mitigation. This is again, going through terminology. And mitigation here means everything, like preventing, reducing, compensating all adverse effects. So you see, the mitigation in disaster risk management means only reducing the risk. The mitigation in climate change means reducing the greenhouse gases, nothing to do with climate, with cultural heritage. And mitigation in heritage impact assessment means everything, like preventing, compensating, reducing, all different strategies you may use. So heritage impact assessment, as I already mentioned, based on the ICOMOS guideline 2010, is subject to 4 major threats to cultural heritage sites. Only these 4, like urban or rural development, like change of the policy, land use and urban planning, tourism infrastructure and increased visits, and also archaeological excavation and mining activities. So heritage impact assessment is going to identify and predict the impacts of these kind of threats and mitigate the adverse effects. An example would be like this in Schönbrunn Palace and Garden in Vienna. And you can see some kind of construction in 2004, which affect the visual integrity of the palace and the garden. And following some meeting and discussion, they just accepted to cut some story of the buildings. And also this one in the Bulgaria, in Sofia in Bulgaria, this is the archaeological excavation while they're doing like a transportation, underground transportation system. They just faced archaeological site, and then the municipality decided to remove all the different valuable objects to the museum. But following some discussion with ICOMOS Bulgaria, they just decided to move only 20% of the movable objects, and because of to retain the authenticity of the place and to retain the authenticity of the historic layers and identity of the place, the municipality accepted to keep it, this archaeological, as it is. So, heritage impact assessment within the environmental impact assessment. So, based on the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive of European Union, 2014, you will see cultural heritage is already included within the environmental impact assessment, which is a very powerful tool and legally binding. So, yeah, I'm finishing. Article 3, the environmental impact assessment shall identify, describe, and assess the direct and indirect significant effects of a project on the following factors. And one of these factors is material assets, cultural heritage, and the landscape within the environmental impact assessment. Then for the protection and promotion of the cultural heritage comprising urban historical site and landscape, which are an integral part of the cultural diversity, which is clearly identified here within the environmental impact assessment, the role of cultural heritage. To better preserve historical and cultural heritage and landscape, we should go through the visual impact of the project. And I think we have the chance to listen to Professor Kloos, Dr. Kloos, today, because he's a very well expert in terms of heritage impact assessment and in particular the impact on visual integrity in environmental impact assessment. So, while the cultural heritage has been already included within the environmental impact assessment, why we need a separate methodology of heritage impact assessment? So this is the question. The cultural heritage is already included within the environmental impact assessment. Why the heritage community started a new approach, a new framework and methodology for heritage impact assessment? Why we are separating cultural heritage from the environment? So the answer is the heritage community just realized that the cultural heritage is included within environmental impact assessment, yes, of course, but it has been neglected in a lot of environmental impact assessment in different countries. And the problem is that dealing with cultural heritage sites, we are dealing with a lot of qualitative values, which is quite different because first of all, we need to assess the different values of cultural heritage sites, and then we need to measure the loss in different values at the end. So this is very different. Another issue is that when it comes to World Heritage Sites, we are dealing with outstanding universal value, authenticity, and integrity. And environmental impact assessment community, they have no idea about this kind of conditions and these kind of terms, and how we can deal with these kind of terms within the environmental impact assessment. And the third one is that within the mitigation strategies, only conducting mitigation strategies within the environmental impact assessment is not enough. Because when we deal with the cultural heritage, we should assess if these mitigation strategies in the future may affect the values, may affect the authenticity or integrity. If this kind of mitigation strategy, in general mitigation strategy, are suitable for cultural heritage values, so they have no idea about this kind of values again. So at the end, these are the reasons why the heritage community started to develop new tools called heritage impact assessment. But from my point of view, we need this methodology, but at the end, it should be integrated within the broader environmental impact assessment to use all these different legal, economic, and technological resources. This is the methodology of environmental impact assessment. And within the methodology for cultural heritage site and impact assessment, we may have this methodology again by INSCR 2004. First of all, we need to identify the project. Then we need to assess the values of our cultural heritage sites. And then we need to identify the stage of development project. And based on this data, we may identify and assess the impacts of development project around cultural heritage sites. And my three last slides are focused on an integrated approach. So is it possible? So you just learned that we have 3 different assessment tools for 3 different categories of like hazards or threats. So the question is that it is possible to combine these different methodology, because at the end we are going to protect our cultural heritage site from all these different threats and like hazards. But you just realize that there are a lot of differences between the terminology, between these different assessment tools in terms of terminology, methodology, and also stakeholders. If you take a look at this diagram, a multiple hazard or threats which may cause disasters or which may affect the cultural heritage sites. We have the natural system, like climate, weather, geology, hydrology, and we have the anthropogenic systems, our society, economic issues, urban planning, heritage conservation, community, and all these different stakeholders and sectors. So this like anthropogenic system, there are a lot of interrelations between this human-induced environment and our natural system. And the climate change is something which may affect this interrelation between these 2 different environments. The natural system may cause the natural hazards, like earthquake. Also, in terms of earthquake, we need to, for example, go through the secondary hazard. For example, earthquake may cause fire, floods, a lot of things like that. Then we have a lot of man-made threats, like terrorism, looting, like land use change, like pollution from our built environment. And then we have also the climate change issues, the gradual effects, like sea level rise, thermal shock, humidity change. And all these different threats and hazards are linked to each other in causing disasters and in affecting our cultural heritage sites. And we need to consider the interrelation between these different systems. Otherwise, we fail in managing the risks. Because, for example, the poor urban planning may increase the vulnerability to earthquake. Earthquake will increase the vulnerability to economic development. A lot of things like that. So we need to integrate these different tools. Like this, as I mentioned, we have these 3 different categories of threats: development and tourism pressure, climate change, natural hazards, affecting our cultural heritage sites, but not only the physical one, but the physical loss, economic loss, environmental loss, and social-cultural loss we may expect from these different threats on our cultural heritage site and its setting. And we are dealing with 3 different methodologies. And my last slide is this open question, which I would like to share with you in terms of protection of cultural heritage sites. In order to increase cultural heritage resilience and promote its protection from all sorts of natural and human-induced threats and hazards, do we need to develop an integrated framework and comprehensive assessment methodology to combine these 3 different tools: disaster risk assessment, climate change assessment, and heritage impact assessment, specific to cultural heritage sites? So preparing a very, an integrated assessment methodology for all types of threats and hazards? Or we need to integrate the cultural heritage within different disciplines and within the different existing risk assessment or management system in regional, national, and international level. For example, for disaster risk assessment of cultural heritage, we have the urban disaster risk management. And we need to integrate cultural heritage within the disaster risk management, within the existing one. Or for climate change impact, we have the climate change impact policies. We need to integrate cultural heritage site because the cultural heritage site is part of our environment. And also for heritage impact assessment, there are a lot of debates that the heritage impact assessment at the end should be integrated within the environmental impact assessment because it comes from environmental impact assessment. So in this case, if we integrate everything, then how we can integrate this, how we can address different sectors and different disciplines. And if we integrate the cultural heritage site into different sectors and disciplines, how we integrate, how we can produce an integrated assessment approach for different hazards. Because as I mentioned, there are a lot of interrelation between different hazards and threats, and we should address this. Thank you.